So let's just get this out of the way real quick. What is this show? Well, let's try an analogy. You don't go to the Chinese takeaway down the street looking for an accurate representation of foreign cuisine. No, you want sugary meat slop and a bad stomachache. Well, that's Giblets, analysis of video games that's sure to make you fat, tinged with sinful regret, and delivered ice cold. Sound good? Dead Rising begins inside a helicopter, flying over the fictional town of Willamette, Colorado. We discover that we're Frank West, a pudgy, overconfident photojournalist who's heading to this nowhere dump to investigate reports of civil unrest. Only the quiet shuffling of his tan penny loafers and the snap of the camera's shutter can be heard here, and over the loud whine of the rotor there's an air of illegitimacy that's hard to shake. Following up a scoop on something big probably shouldn't involve evading attack helicopters piloted by the National Guard, but I guess when you're freelance sometimes you take drastic measures for a payday. Following this is a brief segment where we actually assume control. While the rest of the game takes place entirely from the third person, starting it down the barrel of a camera subtly communicates the kind of person the protagonist is, even when the stilted dialogue can't. Frank's confident when he's purveying a scene from a distance. He directs the pilot and frames the action appropriately because he knows precisely what to draw from the events occurring below. He's at his untainted, theoretical best here, but it's easy to forget that all of this takes place essentially inside a giant cutscene. You can't exactly call it a QuickTime event, but at least conceptually that's what you're doing here. What makes QTEs annoying in most games is that their delicately choreographed events are out of sync with the mundane reality of you mashing a button over and over again. They make your input appear representational of a character's consciousness, even though their actions far exceed the capability of the normal controls. You and Dad are totally fixing the car together. It just so happens that whenever actual repair work has to occur, Dad swipes the wrench you were fiddling with, and you get to hold the light for him. And sure, in Dead Rising's version of these, all you're doing is taking photos, but that's precisely why it isn't frustrating. Mundanity has the incredible benefit of actually being believable. Something as basic as moving a camera around isn't conceptually outlandish, and it provides a reasonable canvas to paint a bespoke scenario on. Introducing the threat of zombies from a viewpoint completely detached from the scripted action allows the player to exercise relevant agency. As a photographer, it makes sense to be this far away from the subject, and it makes sense to exploit it for personal gain, even if Frank's taking photos because the plot says he does, and all you're doing it for is, well, experience points. The player is promptly ripped from this single-use conception of what they'll be doing and dropped directly into the world it implies. Frank exhibits some slick photographic expertise in the helicopter, but that's exactly his weakness. Almost none of the game takes place there. Once we find ourselves on solid footing, we're introduced to the ineptitude of his movement. He doesn't run so much as awkwardly shuffle with a restless gait, and to make things worse, the camera has a sluggish delay, making it hard to see anything that's not directly in front of you. Pulling out into third person provides more than just literal perspective. It's certainly quiet, too quiet, but moreover, that air of apprehension makes you feel insignificant. You're not even the most succulent beefcake here, and this is only the roof. The game unfolds within the industrial confines of this shopping mall, and if you've ever actually had to work in a place like this, you know it's a spot-on depiction. Anyone who's had to carry minimum wage down this cheaply painted cinder block hell twitches involuntarily just by looking at it. The harsh fluorescent light makes you feel like the concrete masonry unit of people, hollowed out and symmetrically jammed together for the utmost efficiency. Humanity be damned. The shopping floor attempts human strife with self-appointed male leader and agitated old lady, but it cracks under the brazen intent communicated by the user interface. More than any canned dialogue would, one word and an empty number efficiently plot the arc of tension to an inflection point. The contrast between queasy exploration and utter pandemonium is totally stark, and it's mostly because of the exact point this tender atmosphere bursts wide open. The overbearing text and deafening cacophony of primal moans couldn't convey sheer, unbridled panic any clearer. You might be wary enough to realize that running away from it all is the best solution, but the player will likely attempt to at least arm themselves here. Engaging any tactile sense beyond putting foot to pavement is a bad idea though. Nothing but primal instincts can save you here. It's clear you lack the facilities to cope with the environment you've been dumped into. and the game disallows any chance to gain them once that naive hope of survival is stripped away. Beneath your shortcomings lies the safety net of the plot, waiting to catch you the moment you tumble. Even if you lose all your health here, close variants of the same protagonist-saving measures will play out. Plucking away the opportunity to learn from your mistakes is surprisingly agitating, and swiftly establishes not only the permanence of your actions, but its anticlimax when you can't instantly try again. In any case, you're given a miraculous out by people with just as nicely textured clothes as you. It's a key indicator of their importance, by the way. The guy who saves you, Brad, is a chiseled man of action. A dude with a gun who brandishes a swank mustard yellow shirt like no one else can. While Jesse is his plot-propellant associate who keeps an eye on things in the security room. Their veiled motives soon intertwine with your insatiable thirst for the facts, and you promptly team up. With the promise of this relationship established, the player is released into the seething maw, carrying only a map, a watch, and the affirmation they're entirely unprepared.
I managed to stop the bleeding, but he's running a fever. He needs medicine.
A fever? Medicine, huh?
West as a concept is so wholly bland that everyone's clear enumeration of their goal to him doesn't feel as contrived as it does boring. And to make matters worse, the cutscenes are crudely jammed together, with all the subtlety of a Windows Movie Maker transition, pieced together without even the suggestion of continuity. Though it tries desperately to be, the plot, it's just not that interesting. The open-ended framework it's contained within is the part that's engaging, and so much so that it actually manages to salvage the lackluster content. Like many games, Dead Rising has a scaled day-night cycle, but it isn't just for show. The player is given 72 game hours to complete a strictly linear order of case files occurring at specific points across the 3-day period. If you're a couple minutes late but near the starting area of a mission, the game lets it slide, but they're often packed so tightly that your inefficiencies getting to them have unresolvable knock-on effects. If you don't do whatever it is you have to do in time, the plot just stops. That's it. The game will ask you if you want to start over, but if you don't, all you can do is run around and complete side missions until inevitably it ends. What's more, cutscenes are only active for a single hour or 5 minutes of real time. You better be sure you're around to see them happen, because there's nothing more infuriating than wasting hours of time solely because you weren't there to see some garbage dump of exposition. And if you don't think the game won't try and take advantage of this vicious cycle, consider the fact that the first real case activated is a boss battle. They're called psychopaths here, and yeah, sure, they have interesting attack cycles and might even show a little humanity in defeat, but any provocative design they possess gets smothered by their glaringly conspicuous purpose. They exist solely to eat your time, and are ferociously vexed by insufficient shooting controls that don't even begin to provide the level of finesse required. That's something that becomes very prevalent when playing through Dead Rising. Nothing feels as if it was built for the player. Nothing's there to lend them a hand. The game doesn't want to help you. Bringing up the watch to select quests won't pause the game. The guide arrow can't track diagonal lines efficiently. Even the health bar is misleading. The last block contains more hit points than the rest, making it hard to discern just how close to death you really are. Perhaps more significant than all of those is the save system, which limits the player to 1 save per device and can only be accessed through specific points laboriously stretched across the far reaches of the map. This means that even if you're fortunate enough to have multiple devices to save your character across, the length of time it takes to get to a point where you can actually exploit that workaround makes it entirely redundant. It forces vital considerations that prey on your desire to avoid replaying large swaths of the game, creating an ever-present sense of agoraphobia during the large gaps between missions. Since grinding to earn experience involves making your way out into the barbaric abyss, and it always feels as if you have far less time than you actually do, lazing around in the control room chugging coffee creamer quickly becomes a tantalizing alternative. Trying to improve the way you play Dead Rising is consistently discouraged. The overwhelming desire to procrastinate instead of learning how to cope with its unscrupulous concoction of pain and despair, disabling the chance for meaningful progression. The game's like your college professor. It'll curtly speak up to affirm your failure, but in the interim of barreling towards this inescapable pit of shattered dreams, it's deadly silent. Your perception of the game's world shrivels down into a linear path of previously successful decisions, and lops off the remainder of possibility by enforcing strict temporal consequences for trying to deviate from it. So yeah, navigation is an endlessly stressful experience. But when you do memorize enough of the plot structure to do it with any level of autonomy, what do you find? One of the first things you'll discover is that zombies are pleasantly docile. They'll attempt a belated swipe if you're shoulder to shoulder with them, but keep your distance and they're content to remain ignorant of your existence. Since they're grouped together in large clumps, it's easy to skirt the radius of which they'll leave you alone. But it also means that if you're unwary enough to be attacked by one, zombies in the vicinity will crowd around and punish your indecision with overwhelming volume. I'm sure this kind of hive mind AI is partly a technological limitation of the Xbox 360, which probably couldn't process the individual behaviours of every zombie on screen at a reasonable frame rate. But in terms of promoting confidence, their predictable characterization is incredibly successful. It becomes second nature to punch through their barricade of flesh within minutes of playing, meaning you'll eventually feel brave enough to stop and actually observe them. Zombies possess different traits based on their appearance. Overweight ones have additional health, police carry nightsticks and pistols and hang around in groups. These Hawaiian shirt dudes will even blindside shank you if you aren't careful enough. Of course, all of them still drop in a few hits, and their broad scale makes strategizing against their quirks pointless. But it does mean that mowing down an assorted group of former humans is as gross as you'd expect it to feel. You pick out their differences as you're cutting them apart, swatting aside their easily expendable mortality and watching them congeal indecipherably on the ground. They are the quintessential monster distraction, inconsequential as life forms, but waiting to snatch you away the moment you regard them as such, the same way classical zombies do. Although the game's packaging really doesn't want you to think of them that way. Maybe I'm just a total coward, but even when I'm standing in an empty room and I know that zombies don't spawn there, I still check my back. There's nothing there, and it's a mathematical certainty there never will be, but it grates at my nerves anyway. The desiccated mass of humanity will casually chip away at your health and patience, their unending pervasiveness making more navigation a stressful exercise. To make matters worse, there's the possibility of stumbling into a side mission while in the midst of doing something more important, further depleting your barren time reserves. If you're particularly unlucky, you might run into a psychopath encounter, but more often than not, the scoops you find are escort missions. These seem simple enough. Talk to the person in trouble, solve whatever problem they may have, and bring them back to the security room for a handsome boost to your experience. The only problem is that maneuvering the crowded mall with these people in tow is like descending Mount Everest in a shopping trolley missing its fourth wheel. The concept of survival is entirely foreign to them. They're needlessly antagonistic, and frequently stop and fight zombies right up until the point of death. Issuing straightforward commands will sometimes maybe get them to follow you after they've finished killing themselves, so getting back to the security room requires you to wade in after them, and somehow swat aside the enemies eating them without also chainsawing their head off. It comes to be a slight annoyance. There's definitely a side of me that views this friendly but unpredictable AI as a macabre simulation of guttural, human fear. Why should people obey the weird gigantic shoulder man when they've just lasted this long without his help? Unless you've just saved their lives, survivors are understandably wary, so getting them to follow you involves finding a way to appease them. Yes, usually this results in the player spamming the talk button with zombies bearing down their neck, but every so often there are small environmental interactions that establish momentary trust in this surly hellscape. People helping one another when combated with the direst of situations. It's not a complex idea, but its sharp contrast with the larger plot of Dead Rising is why the story lacks any consequence, even though the entire game trades on that concept of permanence. Since the main source of drama in cutscenes is flesh-eating monsters, the stakes can only be life or death. There's no opportunity for nuance when failure forever equals having your face torn off. This heightens the importance of the in-game protagonist, whose blunt presence means they have to have a direct connection with the player. When character dialogue is nothing but text and weirdly repurposed grunts, and can potentially constitute a massive waste of your time, the cutthroat world of harsh viscera begins to have merit. It suits that characters you don't control are just as interested in self-preservation. NPCs can follow you, but will pursue their own violent agenda before doing so. When you consider that their best case scenario is shivering in some hole for 3 days, A misguided survival attempt seems like a suitable reaction, even if it does make you want to tear your hair out. The immediate physical implications of the world are given precedence over their lasting logical concerns, and making peace with the game's artifice requires you to take that logical leap. The katana is incredibly effective against both zombies and bosses, and is ridiculously fun to use, but why does it spawn on this shop awning? Who can say. As long as the player navigated the glut of zombies to reach it, the reward is suitable. But the game's honest about this. All of the garish world building doesn't pretend to be anything more than it is, and remains internally consistent because structurally it's cognizant of the insanity. While the prioritization of rewarding exploration is clear, there is still considerable effort put into making the bizarre logical conceits somewhat believable. The proportions of the map are suitably spacious, and everything is coated in a subdued colour palette that provides crisp contrast. It's not exactly film grain, but there's certainly a level of grit that suits the stoic veneer of exaggerated self-seriousness. Its lack of commentary on the presented scenarios makes any flourishes that break through all the more noticeable. Up until now, I've been thinking as someone playing with fresh eyes, because my memories of that perspective are by far the most evocative. Endless failure is still the most notable part of this game, but what you're watching is by rough estimates my 4th playthrough. Even with a new save, the overbearing sense of disempowerment new players feel is completely absent. I know where to go, and I know what to do because I've developed a personal list of directives and priorities. Once you've gotten used to how the temporal systems operate, the oppressive hellscape suddenly becomes a playground of experimentation. Frank and your perception of how he operates gets progressively more outlandish the more of the game you play, because your own direction shapes how he acts and behaves. If Dead Rising stuck to its introductory cadence and ignorantly progressed the player regardless of their actions, then obviously it wouldn't be engaging. It chooses to promote nothing, and lets the player decide whether they'll excel in its kitschy sense of experience, or wallow in anguish depending on the extent to which they're capable of enduring its hardships. This ability to self-direct congeals the tone of the story and the physical implementation of that style, and it's this combination that forms the narrative. Scheduling how you'll arrive at tasks and finding efficient ways to reliably stick to that structure is arguably more important than their actual execution. Which is fine if you forget that internalizing a timeline and deconstructing it to your own personal whim requires patience in a place that just isn't fun to be in. The cascading complexity of inalienable deadlines, malevolent animation priority, and ruthless consequence is nothing short of stressful. Appreciating the game as a unique and well-constructed facsimile of zombie tropes can only be done from an analytical distance. It would be hard to argue that the elements creating this whole aren't well considered, even when the game is completely fucking you over. The fact that you can predict and iterate on besting that spite proves it's tonally sustained and mechanically cohesive. But Dead Rising is forever stained by a lingering permanence that overtakes your desire to persevere. There have legitimately been times where I've had to stop playing because a pool of anxiety has swelled in a game that seems too goofy to be motivated in that way. If you go out and play Dead Rising, don't prepare yourself for a scare, because even when its technical elderliness was non-existent, that's not what it provoked. Go to your cupboard, take out the strongest painkillers, and pop them down as soon as you feel that headache, because it's only going to get worse.